On a summer night in 1944, the largest explosion ever to strike the American home front tore through a Navy base in California. More than 300 men were killed in an instant. Almost all of them were black sailors, doing the most dangerous job in the Navy, a job no one had trained them for. And when the survivors were ordered to go back and do that same job again, with nothing changed, 50 of them said no. For that one word, the Navy called them mutineers. This is a story that took 80 years to set right. The place was called Port Chicago. It sat on the water northeast of San Francisco. And during the Second World War, it became one of the busiest ammunition ports on the entire West Coast. From its single long pier, bombs, shells, and depth charges were loaded onto cargo ships bound for the war in the Pacific. It was some of the most dangerous work in the entire military. One mistake, one spark, and there would be nothing left to bury. The work itself was brutal and primitive. Day and night, the men hauled live munitions out of rail cars and lowered them into the holds of the waiting ships, much of it by hand, by rope, and by net. Some of those bombs weighed hundreds of pounds. The men worked long shifts, in all weather, lifting and stacking explosives that were never meant to be handled the way they were being handled here. Many of the bombs arrived without the safety devices that should have made them stable. The men were simply expected to be careful and to be fast at the same time. And almost every man doing that work, down on the pier, in the holds of the ships, lifting those live munitions by hand, was black. The officers standing over them, with the clipboards and the orders, were white. That division was not an accident. It was the policy. This was a segregated Navy in a segregated country. The official policy of the time kept black and white servicemen apart, and it decided what kind of work each man was allowed to do. The white sailors at Port Chicago were the officers. The black sailors were the labor. Many of these young men had enlisted, hoping to fight for their country, to serve at sea. Instead, they were handed the heavy, deadly work of loading ammunition under the command of white officers who often had no real training in explosives either. There were no proper safety procedures. The men were never taught how to handle the bombs they carried every day. They learned on the job from each other, hoping that what they did not know would not kill them. And worse, the officers were said to compete against one another, pushing their divisions to load faster, even placing bets on whose men could move the most tonnage in a shift. A job that should have been done slowly and with extreme care was turned into a race. The men begged for training. They pointed out the dangers. They were told to keep working. Some of the men had even gone to their officers before the disaster and warned that something terrible was going to happen. They were brushed aside, and so they kept loading day after day, knowing in their bones that it was only a matter of time. They were right. These were men who had volunteered to defend their country, and their country had told them they were good enough to die in its service, but not good enough to be trained, not good enough to be kept safe, and not good enough to be treated as equals. They carried that knowledge with them every single day, down onto that pier. And then came the night that proved them right. It was just after 10 at night on the 17th of July, 1944. 2 cargo ships sat at the pier. One of them was nearly full, with thousands of tons of explosives already in her holds, and a long line of rail cars packed with still more munitions waited alongside. The night shift was hard at work under floodlights. In a single, blinding instant, it all went up. There was a sharp crack, and then a roar that no one who survived it would ever forget. The blast was so enormous that it registered on earthquake instruments at the University of California, miles away, like a small earthquake rolling under the bay. Both ships were obliterated. The pier, the rail cars, the men working on them, all of it simply ceased to exist. A column of fire and smoke climbed thousands of feet into the night sky. A pilot flying overhead reported chunks of glowing metal, some of them the size of a house, flying higher than his aircraft. In the town of Port Chicago itself, more than a mile away, people were thrown from their beds. Windows shattered across the region. Walls cracked. Roofs caved in. For a few seconds, those who lived through it thought the war had somehow reached the coast of California. 320 men were killed that night. Hundreds more were wounded. It was the worst home front disaster of the entire war, the deadliest single event to strike American soil in those years. And of the men who died, the overwhelming majority were the black sailors who had been down on that pier and in those holds, loading the ships. Many of them were never found. There was simply not enough left of them to identify. Whole families would learn only that their sons were gone, with nothing to bring home. What happened in the days after the explosion tells you everything about how these men were valued, because the way the survivors were treated was almost as cruel as the blast itself. In the aftermath, many of the white officers were granted 30 days of survivor's leave to recover from the shock of that night. No such leave. Instead, they were ordered back onto the wreckage to do the unthinkable. They were made to clear the twisted debris and to gather what remained of the bodies of their own friends. Men who had just lived through the largest explosion the country had ever seen were now pulling the pieces of the dead out of the mud and the water by hand, with no counseling, no rest, and no acknowledgement of what they had been through. Think about what that does to a young man, to survive that blast, and then to be told that your job now is to collect the remains of the men you ate breakfast with that morning. These survivors carried that horror with them for the rest of their lives, and the Navy treated it as just another work detail. And then, only weeks later, with no investigation finished, no cause determined, no new training given, and no safety changes made of any kind, the surviving sailors were ordered to pick up exactly where they had left off. They were marched to a nearby depot across the water and told to load ammunition again. The same work, the same danger, the same officers, the same lack of training that had just killed 320 of their brothers, as if nothing had happened at all. Put yourself in their place for a moment. You have just survived the deadliest blast of the war. You have just carried the remains of your friends out of the rubble. And now you are being marched back to do the very thing that killed them, with nothing changed to keep you alive. What would you do? When the order came to resume loading, more than 200 of the men refused to go. This was not a riot. There was no violence, no weapons, no shouting down of officers. The men simply stood together and would not march back onto that pier. They were not refusing to serve their country. They said again and again that they would do any other duty the Navy asked of them. They would dig ditches. They would haul supplies. They would do anything. They would not go back to loading ammunition by hand under the same deadly conditions that had just killed their friends in front of their eyes. Among them was a sailor named Joe Small. Small was a natural leader, a man the others looked to and trusted. When the men were gathered and frightened and unsure, it was Small who tried to keep them calm and disciplined, who told them not to do anything reckless, to stay together and stay peaceful. He was trying to prevent trouble. Later, the Navy would twist that very leadership against him and call him a ringleader of a mutiny. The Navy responded to the work stoppage with threats. The men were lined up and warned, in plain terms, that refusing orders in time of war could be punished by death. It was meant to break them, and for most of the men, it worked. Faced with the threat of a firing squad, the majority relented and went back to the docks. But 50 of them would not. Even with their lives on the line, 50 men held their ground, and for that, the Navy chose to make an example of them that the whole fleet would remember. The 50 men who refused were not charged with disobeying an order. They were charged with mutiny. And that single word changed everything. Because mutiny, in wartime, could carry a death sentence. It became the largest mass mutiny trial in the history of the United States Navy. 50 black sailors sat together in a military courtroom, in rows, accused of conspiring to seize control by force. 7 senior officers sat in judgment over them. The truth of what had happened was far simpler than the charge. These men had been terrified for their lives, and they had said no to going back. But the word the Navy chose was mutiny, and mutiny carried the weight of a death sentence. Joe Small, the man who had tried to keep the others calm, was singled out as the supposed leader of the plot. The Navy's case rested on the idea that these 50 men had banded together in a deliberate conspiracy against military authority. But the men had no plan, no leader giving commands, no attempt to take anything over. They had a shared and very human fear, and a shared refusal. That is not the same thing as a mutiny, and the men's defense knew it. Their own defense lawyer, a white Navy officer, made the argument plainly. These men may have refused to work, he said, but refusing to work is not mutiny. Mutiny means trying to take over, to seize command by force of arms. And not one of these 50 men had ever tried to take command of anything. They had not raised a hand against a single officer. They had simply stood still together and refused to walk back onto that pier. To call that the largest mutiny in Navy history, he argued, was not justice. It was a label chosen to frighten and to punish. The trial drew the attention of a young lawyer who would one day sit on the highest court in the land. His name was Thurgood Marshall, and at the time he was the chief lawyer for the leading civil rights organization in the country. Marshall flew across the country to watch the proceedings, and what he saw outraged him. He told the press that this was not 50 men on trial for mutiny at all. This, he said, was the entire Navy on trial for its whole vicious policy toward black servicemen. He understood that the men in that courtroom were not the ones who should have been judged. The system that put them on that pier and left them there to die was the real defendant. But the court was not listening. After everything, after the explosion, after the bodies, after the fear, the verdict came, and it came fast. The panel of senior officers left the courtroom to decide the fate of all 50 men at once. They were gone for barely more than an hour. When they came back, they found every one of the 50 men guilty of mutiny. Not one was spared. 50 verdicts, delivered together, after a deliberation shorter than a lunch break. The sentences were 15 years of hard labor, followed by a dishonorable discharge that would brand these men for the rest of their lives. Later, under review, some of the sentences were quietly reduced. The youngest men were given lighter terms, others a few years less. But the convictions themselves stood. 50 men who had refused to throw their lives away for nothing were now, in the eyes of the law, mutineers, stripped of their rank and sent to prison. Many of them were barely out of their teens. When the war ended, the pressure that had been building could no longer be ignored. Civil rights leaders, the press, and even the wife of the president, Eleanor Roosevelt, had spoken out on the men's behalf. Quietly, the Navy began releasing them. By early 1946, nearly all of the 50 had been let out of prison and returned to duty, but the convictions did not go away. The word mutineer followed them home. Many of these men spent the rest of their lives hiding what had happened, never telling their own children, carrying the shame of a crime they had not committed. Years later, when some were offered a pardon, most of them refused it. A pardon, they said, meant admitting they had done something wrong, and they had not. They did not want forgiveness. They wanted the truth. And here is the part of this story that almost nobody knows. What these 50 frightened men did on that dock did not just end with their own lives. It helped change the entire United States military. The outcry over Port Chicago and the glaring injustice of the trial did not fade away when the courtroom emptied. It spread. The story was carried in newspapers across the country. Civil rights leaders held it up as proof of everything they had been saying about how black servicemen were treated. The pressure built year after year, and it became one of the forces that finally pushed the nation to confront segregation inside its own military. Only a few years later, in 1948, the President of the United States signed an executive order that began the desegregation of the entire armed forces, ending the official policy that had put those men on that pier in the first place. The men of Port Chicago never set out to change history. They only wanted to live. But the stand they took on that dock became part of the long road that led to a more equal military, and beyond it, to the wider fight for civil rights that would reshape the country. Recognition for the men themselves, though, came slowly and far too late. In 1999, more than 50 years after the trial, the president granted a pardon to one of the few survivors still living. That man died only a few years later. For the rest, the convictions still stood, and one by one, year after year, the men of Port Chicago passed away with that false word, mutineer, still attached to their names. And then, in 2024, on the 80th anniversary of the explosion, it finally happened. The United States Navy formally exonerated the Port Chicago 50, not a pardon, not forgiveness, a full and complete clearing of their names. The Navy admitted that these men had been wronged, that racism had put them on that pier, and racism had convicted them, and that they had never been mutineers at all. 80 years too late for every one of them to hear it. But the record finally tells the truth. The men of Port Chicago were asked to do the most dangerous work in the Navy with no training and no protection because of the color of their skin. When the worst happened, they were made to gather the bodies of their friends. And when they refused to walk back into the same danger, their own country called them traitors and locked them away. They were not traitors. They were young men who wanted to live and who believed their lives were worth something, even when the Navy acted as though they were not. It took 80 years for the truth to win. The least we can do now is remember their names and the stand they took on that dock when saying one quiet word took more courage than most of us will ever be asked to find. If you believe these men deserve to be remembered, subscribe and stay with this channel. There are more of these stories than you could ever imagine, and almost no one is telling them.